clap for me. I appreciate that. Thank you, Martha. I'm excited to be here. It's always nice to get back to Geneva and not be in CICG, so thank you. It's a nice change of pace. In the interest of time, because I realize we are behind schedule, I'm gonna, as everyone gets mic'd up, I'm gonna pull people up and let them start in the order they are mic'd. So Michael, why don't you come on up? You can be the first one to speak to start. Michael Calabrese is the Director of Wireless Future in the Open Technology Institute at the New America Foundation. And Michael, by virtue of you getting mic'd up before me, you, my friend, get to go first. So would you like to give a little introduction of yourself and what you do at New America?
Okay, sure. So I direct wireless feature at New America. It's a policy institute in Washington, D.C., and I also represent I guess relevant for this panel, a large and diverse coalition of civil society nonprofits in the U.S. that represent consumers, schools, libraries, low-income communities, civil rights and rural groups on all these spectrum and wireless issues. And we strongly believe that competition, digital equity, and broadband abundance, rather than scarcity, depend on more open and shared access to spectrum. Our experience is that a balanced spectrum policy must include two varieties of open public access to spectrum. First, large contiguous channels of license-exempt spectrum that can facilitate Wi-Fi 7 and support very high-capacity apps indoors and everywhere. And second, direct local access to spectrum for enterprise IoT, but also for private 5G networks at schools, libraries, hospitals, and other public venues and critical infrastructure. The model for this, in our view, is the three-tier coordinated sharing framework of CBRS, the Citizens Broadband Radio Service in the US at 3.5 gigahertz. In the US, CBRS is paying major social dividends and provides a model to open additional military and other underutilized bands for dynamic sharing without disrupting incumbents working around them. For example, during the pandemic, school districts and libraries installed access points on their roof or on high poles using free-to-use, the free-to-use general authorized access half of the CBRS band to connect low-income students and library patrons at home to their networks. In the US, another example is on the issue of competition. Competition in mobile broadband service has increased recently because the largest cable internet providers have more than 16 million mobile subscribers to their Wi-Fi first MVNOs. Since the overwhelming share of broadband data is consumed indoors, these networks offload 90% of mobile traffic now to Wi-Fi, and they're beginning to leverage their CBRS licenses, the PAL portion of the band, plus GAA, to increase this value proposition. Finally, as part of our general advocacy of a use it or share it approach to unused spectrum capacity, we recommend that indoor-only underlays of LPI, low power, indoor only, such as we have in the 6 gigahertz band now, worldwide, at least the lower 500 here in Europe, can promote spectrum access and innovation in many additional bands. In short, our perspective is that diverse and direct access to shared spectrum promotes digital equity, competition, and innovation.
Thanks, Michael. I have arbitrarily decided that we're going to go in the order, since you're all up here, of who flew the furthest to get here. So Michael came from California, so he was the furthest, which means Dr. Amnia, Ottawa, I believe, is the next furthest place. So if you'll please vote Dr. Isa Amnia. She's Director of Dynamic Spectrum Access in the Spectrum Policy Branch of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, David. So in Canada, we've adopted several ways of authorizing spectrum use. So we use it all, like first come first serve, competitive processes like auctions, all come all serve, license exempt, secondary market when you subordinate or transfer or divide your license, and also what we call dynamic spectrum access with a database approach or local licensing. But what we learned through all this journey is that spectrum sharing is not to be avoided at all. Like it's something that we need to think about more and more. And it has to be rethought from a different point of view. And I'm going to use the theme of the SA Global Summit today is user-centric. It's not by band and it's not by service. It's the holistic view of sharing. We found out because we have quite strict rules that we can't clear bands. It's almost impossible because moving services out is very costly to stakeholders, and politically it doesn't sound right. So it's so hard to move people out of bands. So what we actually decided to do is to focus on 4 areas. The first one is sharing between similar services. And in that, we have 2 approaches. The first one is the conservative approach, where we avoid any interference for incumbents. We mainly use it for rural and remote areas where there is no business case, and especially for indigenous communities, for mines, for places where nobody wants to. The big players don't have a business case. The other one is more relaxed, where we allow immeasurable interference. And for that, the incentive is to allow more licensees, but it takes a lot of studies and a lot of effort to make sure that the risk that we're taking is measurable. We also encourage people to cooperate together in order to resolve their interference. And it's mainly based on the fact that the new technology is more and more savvy. The receivers and the transmitters have better filters, so they could actually work it out together. The second approach is sharing between different services. And to do that, we had to revisit the definition of harmful interference. So I think somebody this morning said that it was Bernadette. She said there is no one size fits all. And it's true. So every time we try to share between different services, we need to measure again the definition or redefine harmful interference. And examples for that is the 6 gigahertz and also the sharing in millimeter wave between the satellites and the 5G. The third approach, or the third pillar we have is, again, moving away from single band do-it-all networks. So traditionally, we license the band and we anticipate that this band would do everything. I think this is not the case now in the market. New use cases actually are emerging, and carrier aggregation had made frog leaps. As I think Ira said just before us, FCC, they said they could, people are using more combination of low, mid, and high band to cater for the different needs, whether it's capacity, as Alex from Venezia said, or just a specific band or other, temporary services. That actually something that we're looking for more and more. It's basically offering the frameworks and let the user choose. The fourth one is allowing a combination of technologies and services using their existing bands, but from a user perspective, it looks like one network. And Actually, Wi-Fi and mobile, commercial mobile, are not far away. I think they can do it, even if they the Wi-Fi is still, attached to the user, even when there is no service. But also, we have the in-band backhaul. That is something that we see. People use the same band as commercial mobile or in-band backhaul. And the new thing is supplemental coverage by satellite, which is something that before we would say, like maybe years ago, we would have said no. But now we are actually contemplating it, and we have a consultation based on it. So at the end, we found out that we need to do more and more of this, and we need to examine our existing approach. We need to listen more to the users and stakeholders, so our doors are always open for ideas. Operators or new users that are coming to actually tell us that they can share better. They have an idea, and they want us to see if the rules can cater for them. We also need what we're doing now. We are trying to better collect our data, because if you want to do more sharing, we need accurate data. We need to create the data, and actually, if we want AI or automation in general, we need to have the right data. And we also, in order to, because sharing, actually from a regulator point of view, is a burden on the officers, on the operations. So in order to actually reduce that burden, we're looking at automating our processes more and more. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's a very comprehensive overview of what's going on in Canada. We appreciate that. I think one of the things that you mentioned, and I would love, Olivia will go next, to expand upon is, as you noted, sometimes the rules can be challenging. One of the nice things about this panel is that we have some Olivia here to talk about how the legislature looks at this, and using my completely arbitrary system of who's coming from the furthest, and Alan and Olivia came from the same place, I've decided to go by order of constitutional creation. So Article 1, you get to go first. This is Olivia Trusty. Olivia is a professional staffer on the U.S. Senate Committee on Armed Services. She works for Ranking Member Roger Wicker, who is senator from Mississippi, who is the highest ranking Republican on the committee. And Olivia, thanks for being with us.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be on this panel. So as David Riddle mentioned, I work on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And in that role, we have jurisdiction and oversight over the Department of Defense and U.S. military affairs. So when it comes to DoD, access to spectrum is a national security imperative. U.S. forces rely on spectrum to carry out their warfighting mission, including homeland defense and other operational missions around the world. But as many of you know, that access to spectrum is being challenged. It's being challenged by peer and near-peer adversaries who are seeking to deny access to spectrum for military navigation and military communications. It's also being challenged by legitimate efforts to repurpose spectrum for commercial applications and technologies, all things that are critical to our economic security and prosperity. And so in the face of these competing spectrum interests, DoD has identified spectrum sharing through its 2020 Spectrum Superiority Strategy as one possible solution to ensure that warfighters maintain access and freedom of action in spectrum while balancing some of the commercial interests and needs. So as staff on the Senate Armed Services Committee, we've been supportive of exploring the development and use of spectrum sharing technologies. For example, in this year's Senate version of the National Defense Authorization Act, we authorized funding for some demonstration programs to test out particular kinds of spectrum sharing technologies. We also closely monitored the Department of Defense's efforts to put together their emerging mid-band spectrum radar spectrum sharing and burst study in conjunction with the PATH task group. Through that assessment, the findings showed that spectrum sharing is possible but will require some regulatory, technological, and resourcing conditions to be proven and implemented. All in all, though, that was a pretty positive step, I think, from the Department of Defense's view that spectrum, and from industry's view, that spectrum sharing could be feasible. Importantly, though, when it comes to spectrum management, the Armed Services Committee is not the committee of jurisdiction. It is, we're mindful that the Commerce Committee in the Senate and the House Energy and Commerce Committee, they have the pen when it comes to spectrum management and legislation. Not to say that we don't influence that. I think we do, and we've been effective in that regard. But those two committees really, they have the lead on this issue. I point this out because unlike the Armed Services Committee, those two committees, they oversee different agencies, NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and the Federal Communications Commission. And this is important because those two agencies, which I'm sure you'll speak to, have different congressionally authorized missions that may not always align with the Department of Defense mission set. They also oversee different stakeholders who have offered different views, countering views about the viability and efficacy of spectrum sharing. And there are policymakers in Congress who've taken on those views, which creates legislative gridlock, which we're experiencing right now in Washington, D.C. For example, last year was the first time since the Federal Communications Commission had its auction authority that it expired. And despite valiant efforts from political parties on both sides and in both chambers, it's not clear to me at this point what the path forward is. But with that said, I would offer some recommendations or suggestions for policymakers. I think it all starts with having more information, and you spoke to having more data. I think they need more information about who is using spectrum, where it's being used, why it's being used, and where it's being underutilized or where it's at capacity. Some of that information might be classified, but members can get the appropriate clearances to get that information. Secondly, I think there needs to be a better understanding about how the international spectrum policy landscape works, given the increasing overlap or convergence of international spectrum policy issues and domestic policy issues. Third, I mentioned that there are stakeholders who come to us with counterpoints on spectrum sharing. I think there needs to be an understanding among policy makers about where are the disagreements among engineers about why something is not viable, why it is viable, and help them understand in layman's terms what actually is working and where some of the gaps in knowledge may be. And third, I would offer that to the extent there are auctions in the future and there's remaining proceeds or there are appropriations available to target that towards spectrum research and development or upgrading military systems and equipment to avoid harmful interference in sharing scenarios. But ultimately, policymakers will have to make a judgment call. They have the election certificates, and they'll be the ones balancing our national security and economic security interests so that the United States doesn't stay behind. So thank you and appreciate it.
Thanks, Olivia. And I would like to harp on something you pointed out there, which is the PADS report, which was the report in the United States that talked about the 3.1 to 3.45 band. I think marked a bit of an inflection point we'll talk about later. I think it's somewhat telling that we have on this panel, in addition to someone from civil society, 2 representatives from the military community and 2 from the economic agency communities, which I think we can all say 5 years ago was certainly not something we were contemplating and certainly not the norm. So thanks, Olivia, for doing that. We'll move now to Alan Rossner. He's the Director of Spectrum National Security Systems at NTIA, the U.S. National Telecommunication and Information Administration, and in full disclosure, the agency I ran for 2 years, and I miss. But I'm glad you're here to represent NTIA's views and the economic agency views in general in the United States.
Thanks, David, and thanks to the organizers for having us come here. Most of you don't know me, and I'm looking forward to meeting people. I actually was brought into NTIA. I had a 20-year career at DoD, and I was brought into NTIA to help modernize their software tools that they have in the Office of Spectrum Management. That is my primary function in terms of what I'm doing day to day. There's a lot of overlap between that and what's going on in spectrum sharing, so I'm working in that space as well. We work closely with, if you're familiar with how NTIA works, it's kind of the regulator in the US for the federal government side of spectrum use. And as Olivia was referring to, we work very closely with all the federal agencies. And we understand, myself in particular, coming from DoD, we understand how critical those missions are, right, to overall national security and to protecting those missions. But at the same time, NTIA is part of the Department of Commerce. And so at the same time, we're trying to stimulate and motivate any opportunities for advancing spectrum sharing to the extent that we can drive things like broadband expansion, drive the economy, make improvements to reducing the digital divide, which is a heavy focus of NTIA right now. We're also been driven by a presidential mandate in terms of direction from the President of the United States last year to develop a national spectrum strategy. I have a copy of it, which was released in the spring, and that drove an implementation plan, which we are now in the throes of working through. That implementation plan has many aspects to it, including looking at frequency bands 2.7 gigahertz worth, for potential shared spectrum use in the future. But also it is looking at advancing technologies in the dynamic spectrum, or spectrum sharing space. And so that's where I come in. There is a major effort under that part of the strategy to work closely with DoD on a spectrum sharing effort in the 3.1 gigahertz band. And so that effort is just kind of getting started now. We're looking at technological opportunities in terms of what they can, what opportunities exist that can advance on what we did in CBRS and make improvements there. And so we're bringing ideas forward at this point and trying to decide where are the best opportunities to move forward while still protecting those government operations that need to be protected. I'd say that CBRS got a lot of play here from everybody else that's been talking. It's been a great example of the use cases in which spectrum sharing can work. I will note that the use cases are very important to it working. In that particular case, you had a type of radar usage largely along the coast, which opened up a significant amount of space inside the U.S. For CBRS type operations. And so in each of these cases, the incumbent operations have to be looked at closely in concert with what's being proposed from a sharing solution as well. But there's a number of technological innovations we're looking to stimulate. I think, and in that regard, one of the things that NTIA has done as part of their innovation funding at $420 million that was put out as a notice of funding opportunity. And this is part of the Biden administration's Public Wireless Supply Chain Innovation Fund to directly target the hardware supply chain to support projects that are going on to drive commercialization of Open RAN devices. And so I know those proposals are actually being kind of evaluated right now. And some of those will drive technological change, research, innovation in some of this space, which we need in order to advance the state of the art. And I talked a little bit as well about the advanced dynamic spectrum sharing demonstration that we're working with DoD. That's got 6 objectives to it. The first is which to develop a mechanism that evolves beyond the existing automated frequency coordination frameworks like CBRS. Let's move to something even more advanced than that. Demonstrate that DSS can enable the United States to more effectively operate in an adversarial environment. 3, to improve the ability of commercial RANs to share. 4, to obtain data on federal and non-federal sharing and coexistence. And 5, to improve security and obfuscation. That is a concern brought to us by the federal agencies, that they are willing to share, but they also want to protect their information as well at the same time. And 6, to refine our enforcement mechanisms. And I think that's helped setting the stage for us in terms of where we go next in spectrum sharing. I would encourage anybody, if you haven't seen all of the data on CBRS, our partner laboratory that's part of NTIA, the Institute for Telecommunication Sciences, published a report that is available. You can Google it off of their website on CBRS. In a sense, the level of success and the opportunities there. And I know Ira referred earlier to the change in the FCC rules to change how the propagation modeling is done. And the result from that opens up, it was 72 million people that potentially could be served in addition. So that expansion is what we're looking for. We step into these things as research opportunities, right? And we tend to take a conservative approach at first, and that's okay. But then we find out later on, as we did with CBRS, there's opportunities to expand on that even further, and we look to take advantage of those as we move forward. So I think those are my opening comments. I look forward to the dialogue here today.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, over 400,000 CBSDs before the rules even got changed, so more than wireless base stations in the U.S. So thank you for that. Our last presenter to get started is James Youngs, who's with us from the UK Ministry of Defense, which my US English version of Microsoft Word continues to tell me is spelled incorrectly. But James has some slides, so if we can get those loaded up, we'll be good to go.
Thank you for inviting me to the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance event to speak. As it says, I'm James Youngs, UK Ministry of Defence, and I've got some, they should come up, here they go, some important images to share with you. The idea being to imprint them in your brain so that the message gets through. The important two here, the two most important ones are the graph, which is of the growth in mobile data in recent years in the UK and Ireland. And the other important one is that picture of my cat on the right, because we all know what the internet's for. Well, let's have the clean version. We all know what the internet is for. We all know what's driving increased mobile data demand. It's cat videos. So, already lost my notes. So these are our stakeholders in Spectrum in the UK, and the one that you probably don't know of, obviously I work for the Ministry of Defence on the bottom, the one you don't know of is the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, and that's the government department in the UK that's responsible for spectrum policy, and they run the programmes in the UK for spectrum release and sharing, which have been in existence since 2010. Very similar program to the American program. We had a target to release 750 megahertz of spectrum by 2022, and we got most of the way there. And obviously the aim of that is to deliver spectrum into new users so that value can be derived from it. But the important thing when we're talking about spectrum release and sharing, and I don't really want to use the word release because release is a dirty word for defence in the UK, is spectrum sharing. Now, the pie chart there is confirmation that in the UK, we have a lot of spectrum in the UK. We're the biggest spectrum holding entity in the UK, but 85% of the spectrum that's allocated to the UK MOD is actually shared with other people. So we are actually big on sharing. We're doing a lot of work with other people because that's how we're going to make spectrum sharing work. We're doing a lot of work with Ofcom. We have secondees from Ofcom into the Defence Spectrum Policy team because they bring an expertise that we don't have, and they also bring an important ability to translate for us between defence speak and Ofcom speak because they are like totally different languages. One of the benefits of having secondees in our team working with us is that we've been able to work on revising a spectrum sharing framework that we're hoping to announce fairly soon if we get clearance for it. And the idea of the framework is to give much more confidence to defence seniors that we can share spectrum because the framework tells us the terms under which we're sharing it. And if we need to change those terms, it's all laid out in advance. So that's a big benefit we've had from having these Ofcom secondees into our team. The important thing also that I would like to draw your attention to is the bottom part. It's important that we have standards that tell us how we do sharing. And I think it's not just about the technologies, but it's about how we do sharing, because we need to get scale on the sharing if we're to make it work. And one of the things we're looking to do in the UK is to encourage NATO to push forward spectrum sharing as a way for defence organisations across NATO to go forward on it. So you're obviously wondering, what do we think about DSA and dynamic spectrum access and things like that? Well, we've looked into it, and we've looked into a number of flavours of it, but we've found that the responses we're getting from industry and from other people are a bit mixed. We looked in the UK, we obviously had the White Space Devices programme that's recently been wound up, but we found that when we've talked to stakeholders and particularly mobile network operators about, well, if we did some dynamic spectrum access to defence spectrum, how would you feel about that? Mobile operators just don't want it. That doesn't surprise me, but that's the fact we're dealing with. The important thing for defence is we need access to spectrum when we need access, and we actually use a lot of spectrum, but we don't use it all the time. But the important thing is the access when we want it. Our soldiers and sailors and airmen have to be trained as they fight. That's the mantra that defence operates under. And if they're not trained the way they fight, then they won't be effective when they're called on to fight. So that's why the sharing that we're proposing, we need to be the priority user on. And that's something that we think Ofcom is beginning to get, which is really good. So this is the meat of the whole mini presentation. I'll come back to these images and explain them. We accept that mobile and other spectrum users deliver a lot of, for want of a better word, dollar value on what they do, and they support growth in the economy. So that's an important thing for us all to be agreeing for. But most of the spectrum that's been made available from government programs in the last 12 years, in fact, all the spectrum that's come from government release in the UK in the last 12 years has come from defence. There's a limit to what you can do on that. If you continue to take spectrum from defence, you risk your capabilities of your military, you risk having soldiers and sailors and airmen who are not properly trained in the equipment that they're using, and then you get bad outcomes. The ship on the right is HMS Sheffield. Some of you may or may not know that in a small war in the 1980s, the Falklands War, HMS Sheffield was sunk by a missile strike. The reason largely, and this is available on Wikipedia, so I'm not telling any important sensitive information, but the reason it was sunk was largely because the radar system that would have detected the missile was interfered with by another comms system on the ship. Now, you could infer from that soldiers and sailors, or sailors in this case, weren't trained appropriately to use one system when another system was being used. So this is why it's important that we have that mantra. Ukraine, on that image, Ukraine has shown us that warfare changes, and it changes very rapidly. In the last few years, we've had a massive increase in drone use by both the military and also civil users and things like the police forces in the UK. And we've also seen how spectrum usage by the Russians has been over a massive range of frequencies. So your defense organizations need to be trained across a very wide range of frequencies. We are very willing to share spectrum, but we need to share spectrum in a way that operates for defense. And the final overall message of this presentation is that I would caution rushing to take spectrum away from defence users and from other users, not just defence, and placing it in the hands of mobile when we have plenty of data that shows that a lot of the mobile spectrum is unused. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Very much appreciate that. I also appreciate that you left the big pile of US dollars in the slide. Appreciate that also. Moving on to some questions, following up on what James just put up there. Olivia, James was saying that, the Ministry of Defense is, more than willing to be a good sharer, but that they're not getting a lot of signals from the other side that they're willing to take. What do you think changed on the defense side that has made the ministry, and I would assume you'd say also the Department of Defense, more open to sharing?
Sure, I'd say a couple of things. One, I think we've seen improved regulatory, technological, and resourcing conditions. I spoke earlier about how Congress is authorizing funding to support spectrum sharing demonstration programs. I also think the Department of Defense sees value for itself in spectrum sharing, and that it can be more, if it uses its own systems more efficiently, it can use another system more efficiently on the same frequency, potentially. And frankly, I think, some of the writing is on the wall. They're not blind to the external pressures from certain stakeholders who would like to see or to use their spectrum. And the alternative is vacating and relocating their systems, which we've heard will take a lot of money and will last for a number of years. And so being able to maintain access to systems on the frequencies that they're using today, I think is a more ideal outcome for the department.
James, would you say it's a similar approach in the ministry?
I don't think a lot has actually changed in our approach. What we have seen is a major improvement in our relationship, our working relationship with Ofcom, our regulator. So having the secondees in our team has enabled us to get our message over to Ofcom in a much clearer way, and Ofcom actually understand our message now. Having that language translation has made a big difference. So Ofcom understand our need for priority. Ofcom understand our need to hide our use, as was mentioned earlier, obfuscation. We don't want to share what we're doing and where we're doing it. We don't want people to know that, but we are willing to share. And it's evidenced, 85% of the spectrum shared. We could share a lot more, I think, as long as we have that confidence that when we need the access, we get the access.
Alan, speaking of confidence of access, CBRS, which you brought up, that seems to be one of the primary drivers of trying to get CBRS right, was making sure that the naval systems that were in the band had the confidence that they would have access. What has NTIA learned from CBRS? And we touched a little bit on it. Ira talked a little bit about it earlier about how the zones have been shrunk. But what are the lessons that NTIA has learned that it's now trying to apply in the National Spectrum Strategy implementation?
So the first is that it worked, right? And so it was an attempt at sharing, and it was successful. And that's actually driving a lot of things, because it's, that approach is now being proposed in subsequent rulemaking saying, hey, we did it here, we can do it in this band as well. So that's the first, is the fact that it was successful. The second is that it supported that other objective of driving commerce and supporting the economy. And there's plenty of examples of how CBRS is doing that across the United States. And so, as an organization, as part of the Department of Commerce, that's a great thing. That also drives national security. I know it's been said before that, a strong and improving economy drives national security as well. And that thirdly is that we've already started to identify opportunities to improve it, as Ira was talking about. And that opens up the door for us to get closer and closer so that we're not causing harmful interference, but as everybody's confidence is gained in the operation of those two systems side by side, in a sense, that we can kind of pull back a bit on the extent to which we're being conservative. Eventually, I know that we reach a point where we might be causing harmful interference. We're not trying to cross that threshold, but we're trying to get as much, I like to explain it. What we're doing in Spectrum now is we're trying to, we're squeezing juice out of an orange, and we're down to, no greenfield spaces left, and we're trying to see what else we can get out. It's taking some innovative approaches to get there.
Dr. O'Neill, we've talked a lot about the U.S. going down the path of CBRS as our neighbor to the north. Has that been more lessons, more opportunity, or a little bit of both for Canada?
Well, it has been a dilemma for at the beginning because we always looked for harmonization. Like we have one of the longest border ever on this planet, and 80% of our trade is with the U.S. So it's like the first thought is how we can do it together. However, it was not sustainable on our side. Like TV white space was there. It took time to take off. Canada has much smaller population. We didn't have the same problems as the US had. The US problems were quite complex. It needed three stages of access. In Canada, we wanted to have something that we can fall back on so we could sustain it and ensure that there are investment there and the C-band is going to be deployed or that there will be built out there. How this actually forced us to think about how we can actually coordinate together when we have different licensing processes. So US has CBRS, we just auctioned the band, and we have also the 3900, which is non-competitive local licensing in mid-power and low power. And we're still ongoing, we're still, negotiating the agreement is still ongoing. But actually another opportunity that we discovered is that we can use in the interim some temporary rules that we can rely on so the operators can still invest and they can still build, and it's not going to be a risk for the operators on both sides. So we learned a lot through that process. We learned that we can trust each other and we have the right channels to make it work. So yeah, and it's close to be working. So.
Yeah, I think there's, we've heard a lot about harmonization and learning the lessons of each other's countries and sort of being right next to each other with, in addition to being a 4,000-mile long land border, something like 90% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the United States.
Correct.
We have that additional complication. So the lessons across that border could be helpful as we go forward. I think the other thing, and Michael, I'm hoping you can speak a little bit to this, that we're trying to figure out is as we are looking both countries, and I think the UK is doing the same, we seem to be focusing a little more on medium power and lower power applications. You mentioned your 3.9 with your local licensing. Michael, CBRS is undergoing a evolution to CBRS 2.0. I know you just did a paper on it, so I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you, where do you see the future of that band in the US going?
Yeah, so it's actually another part of the success I think Alan was referring to. So we view the three-tier sharing framework of CBRS as a model for sharing large portions of additional military bands, especially in the lower 3 gigahertz, which is nearby. CBRS launched 4 years ago with very conservative rules. And this was understandable because, the military had to trust an automated spectrum access system to protect sensitive military operations, which had never been done in the world before. And what proved essential was building trust over time between the Navy, the US Navy, because it's to protect their radar, and the stakeholders in the band, who were very diligent with an ongoing process. And after 4 years, DoD said there's been no reported interference incidents. And so they agreed to radically reduce the dynamic protection areas. because under the original rules, if the Navy came close to the shore with their radar on or turned on their radar, then the CBRS users would have to change channels almost immediately over gigantic areas. I mean, hundreds of miles. You would lose, you wouldn't lose service, but you'd have to switch to a channel, which turned out to be more complicated. So, given that there was no interference for 4 years, CBRS 2.0 was announced by the government in June, and it authorizes service to an additional 72 million Americans, making a total of 240 million nationwide who can use CBRS without any risk of service interruption when the Navy radar goes on. So we just think that where military systems cannot share with even low power outdoor use, that that something like this, even if it's low power indoor only, is a viable alternative and a complement. So we think the entire band can be shared one way or the other.
That's great. In the interest of time, because I realize we are getting late, and Martha's giving me the eye from over there, I'm gonna go to a little bit more of a lightning round for everybody. So I think one of the things we've heard is that it seems like we're seeing the two models that have reigned supreme in spectrum for so long, right? Which are, exclusive use licensing or government fiat, starting to erode. What incentives do you think need to be put in place for folks to move off of their historic positions or their historic love of their particular licensing and assignment model? James, I'll let you start.
I would love to do this one. I think we should be telling potential users of spectrum bands that this is the terms it's going to be under, and if you don't like it, you don't get it. Because generally, when people see terms they don't like, they just sit there and say, oh, can't we just have the spectrum nationally without any sharing? If you make it very clear that it's sharing, it's my way or the highway, then people will, I think, change their positions. We saw that in the UK when we talked with mobile network operators, when we said to them, the only way we're going to share with you is if you do it dynamically and if you power down when we need the spectrum. When they'd initially said it wasn't physically possible, 5 minutes later it became physically possible.
So in Canada, because we can't really buy people out, like we can, there's not, like we don't give them anything. We actually, the incentives that, one of them is to have timely access to spectrum, because it can take years and years and years to vacate. So we said, like, if you want to have access to the spectrum, we need to find a way of sharing. The second thing is, well, when sharing, the spectrum would be less expensive. So we actually adjust our fees and the auction bids and everything based on the encumbrance and the bands. Also, we protect the incumbents. So from an incumbent point of view, or basically if it's military or satellite or other radio navigation, for example, we need to protect them. And to do so, we're not just letting them figure it out together. We do studies. We negotiate the rules with the industry, with stakeholders, with everybody. We enforce them. We do a compliance check. So it's not like the jungle. We we put really rules and we enforce them. That's actually, we play with the power levels too. So we give them a threshold and then we let them, play within to see. And also in the light licensing, we encourage a lot the cooperation between, we ensure a minimum, protection, but the rest should be actually dealt with by the operators.
Alan, I realize you're in the middle of a implementation plans considering these things, but anything you can share would be helpful.
Certainly. Money's always good, right? Because it is expensive to move out of bands if you have to do it. We're sensitive to that. We're actually in the process of going through plans now for the implementation of the National Spectrum Strategy. And yes, it's very expensive. to even study these things. But I'm going to just harp on improving confidence and security, particularly from a government user perspective, as has already been evidenced in the case, is that confidence improves, that dynamic spectrum sharing can work, then there's greater willingness to use that in a lot more use cases. So, and then obviously, I can't stress this enough, technological innovation that drives all of that.
And Olivia, I'm going to give you one word, and then Michael will close out before we go to questions. You've talked earlier about how the missions of the two agencies, the two departments that are involved are completely different. How hard has it been from a legislative perspective to account for sort of the varying incentives between the Department of Defense and the Department of Commerce?
Sure, very difficult, which is why we find ourselves in the place that we're in today, which is legislative gridlock. But, to kind of follow on to some of the answers that have been given about incentives, I don't know what the proper incentive structure should be from a policymaking standpoint, but I do think we can start with a message change and follow on to some of the points that were made today about we need both. We need both 5G and we need Wi-Fi. These things can coexist. One is probably could be better from a spectrum sharing standpoint for national security, but 5G could be good for economic security, and economic security is national security. And so I think ideally people will approach this with a more open mind, and maybe that will come with time or elections. Hope springs eternal that we can find ourselves in a better position than we are now. But again, I think it is a message change and policymakers needing more information.
Michael, you get the last word. How important is time to market and getting spectrum out there quickly, and from civil society's perspective?
Well, it's very important because you don't want to slow down these advances. Like, for example, what Wi-Fi, the promises of Wi-Fi 7, which will do everything that 5G promised to do, but it can do it anywhere. It can do it in everybody's home or school. So you want to keep driving that forward. But one thing I'll say on the incentives is that at a minimum, when it comes to sharing federal and military bands, we need to start by removing the disincentives. So the U.S. has something that other countries may want to have, but do it better, please. We have a spectrum relocation fund. So the idea was to encourage.
Subtle jab at the moderator. I wrote that law.
Yeah, it wasn't quite complete because the idea was to make sure that to hold agencies harmless if they consolidated their operations or moved to a different frequency band by providing a reimbursement, except that it has two problems. One is it only, at least technically, it only comes into play if there's an auction, and it really needs to reimburse all the costs, including research, testing, compliance, everything, for whatever commercial use, whether it's auction, sharing.
For those that aren't familiar, the Spectrum Relocation Fund in the United States, an auction has to put money into the Department of Commerce to pay to move the incumbents out of the band. It's part of the auction rules.
Right. So we tie ourselves up in knots. Even in CBRS, one reason that CBRS is three-tier, that it's half a kind of an unlicensed general authorized access and half priority access licenses, which were auctioned, was to make sure that there was money to reimburse DoD if necessary, but also to drive the device ecosystem. So removing those disincentives so that federal agencies, and another thing is they should be able to upgrade their equipment. That same fund, it could be a revolving fund instead. It's hard to think of incentives for federal agencies that have missions that aren't financial, but you could remove disincentives.
Yep. Martha, how much time do I have for questions? Like negative 10 minutes? All right, I'll throw it out to questions, and I'll try to keep them very quick if anyone has questions. Go ahead, Szymanski.
So it's a very, very interesting panel. One of the things that I thought about when you talk about spectrum sharing is we're not printing any more of this, right? And so the more that's allocated to a specific exclusive service means that you're starving the other services of opportunities to grow. And so if you look at telecommunications or communications over the last 50 years, there's been tremendous evolution. And, obviously we don't know how your defense systems are going to evolve, what the capabilities are, how the technologies are going to be used. So how do you think about this? Could you see a world where the license is provided for a shorter duration, period of time, lighter license, so that that spectrum could be refarmed? Or is it sort of like, it's gone? Because I think right now, the way that industry thinks about it is once a decision's made, that spectrum's out of play, and that makes it, much more of sort of a battlefield. Thanks.
Would you say, just because I had just mentioned how in CBRS there were priority access licenses that were auctioned, well, the original order, when this was originally adopted, the licenses were going to be for 3 years and very small areas. And then a new administration came and changed that to a little more of a traditional thing. The licenses were still somewhat small, counties, but now the licenses are unlimited term with automatic renewal, just like the regular mobile carrier licenses. And not coincidentally, Verizon bought the greatest number of those licenses. So you can do it, and it's good to have this diversity. So we should be thinking about, as we put new spectrum into play, even through auction, that they could have an actual term limit. They could be smaller so that more players could get involved.
James?
You're still taking it, that's still for the mobile service, right? So when you're thinking about this, you're taking the spectrum out of play for the other services. So you're giving other
flexible
people
use. CBRS is flexible use.
well, satellite, say, or so you're still looking at it for a different type of mobile service. And so I've just been thinking about this. We know that technology is going to evolve, and I want certainty. So I'm not saying, hey guys, give us 2 years license, because no one's going to buy our equipment, right? But there's probably a fine line here, because your needs are going to evolve. Anyway, I just didn't know how you were thinking about it.
I'll take the above everybody approach for a second, having sat in the executive and the legislature and been a regulator. The challenge with that usually is that the time duration of the missions you can't really account for. And even when you can, particularly with our defense colleagues, it's not like when you reach the end of the arbitrary time you set for how long you're going to license a long-range interceptor radar that you're just going to turn it off because you hit the end of the license period. And that's historically been one of the real challenges, is how do you figure out how to amortize a government use, which has a completely different set of incentives and a completely different set of timelines, versus a commercial use where you're iterating very quickly. So, and I didn't mean to steal your thunder, but moderator's prerogative to jump in.
Oh, sir. Okay. We actually have some frameworks where we have yearly renewal with high probability of renewing the license based on a yes or no. So if you have a deployment there, you get renewed right away. What's happening is that we adjusted the fees accordingly. So you're not paying for 10 years, you're not auctioning it. And actually it worked. And initially we give 2 years for deployment. So you have 2 years to deploy, then yearly after to show that you have a site there, and it's very localized. But it's an assurance somehow, like it's a middle way between having, an assurance and a security of your spectrum. And it's flex use. You can do whatever, fixed wireless access, fixed links, mobile, industrial verticals, whatever.
Because then you can assess it on an annual basis.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Can I,
David.
Go for it. Yeah, James.
I have a problem with that question that was just asked, in that there is an assumption behind the question that by not releasing spectrum or sharing spectrum, that we are depriving other users of the ability to grow